Sí, Garrett, antes de empezar con el siguiente panel, también te quería preguntar, bueno, más o menos cuáles son tus sensaciones después de esta primera charla, ¿no? A mí me gustó mucho porque, como les dimos a los panelistas libertad para, digamos, comentar sobre lo que quisieran, no solamente eligieron hacer foco en libros que recomendaran positivamente, digamos, normativamente, sino también en lo que hay que leer para entender lo que está del otro lado, ¿no? A mí me pareció muy bueno eso.
Sí, a mí siempre me parece muy interesante y muy importante la lectura de aquello con lo que uno no está de acuerdo, ¿no? A mí siempre me ha quedado una idea que me dijeron mis padres cuando era muy pequeño: para conocer y para criticar primero hay que conocer. Entonces, qué mejor que hacer las lecturas de aquello con lo que uno prima facie, intuitivamente siente que están las antípodas, a lo mejor incluso lo que uno cree, pero así de esa manera tiene las herramientas como para poder hacer una crítica seria y no una crítica completamente desprovista de argumentos. Así que me gustó mucho cómo se fue dando la conversación. Hubo una pelota que iba yendo de un lado al otro, puntos que se iban compartiendo de manera bastante espontánea. Y ya son las 1:30, es momento, me parece, de pasar al siguiente panel, Falcone.
Efectivamente, vamos a ir agregando acá a nuestros invitados para el segundo panel. Muchísimas gracias, Garrett, por
Nos
liderar
vemos después.
este primer panel. Nos vamos a ver en un rato. Nosotros vamos y venimos, entramos y salimos. Este es el segundo panel del Congreso Iberoamericano de Liberalismo Cultural. Se va a llamar Hacia una libertad liberal. ¿Qué pasa hoy en el liberalismo? Es un panel bilingüe en español e inglés, así que yo voy a estar hablando primero en español, después en inglés. Welcome, Tom. Welcome, Eamonn. Welcome to our English-speaking audience. This is going to be a bilingual panel at the second conference for cultural liberalism. This panel is going to be called Towards a Liberal Liberty, What is Going On with Today's Liberalism? So I will be switching back and forth between English and Spanish. We will have English-speaking panelists, Spanish-speaking panelists. I will try to bridge the two worlds with my questions afterwards. But we will listen to our first three panelists in the first place. So, en español, para nuestra audiencia, la idea de este panel es hablar sobre el estado del liberalismo a nivel global, o a nivel regional, o a nivel local, lo que nuestros panelistas deseen discutir. Podrían hablar sobre casos específicos, sobre partidos, sobre debates intelectuales, donde haya algún tipo de disputa acerca de los términos libertad y liberalismo. También se puede discutir de manera un poco más abstracta, sin hacer mención a casos específicos. Podemos hablar de figuras públicas, de movimientos que se denominan liberales, pero quizás no lo son, o que nosotros creemos que no lo son. Queremos que nuestros panelistas tengan tanta libertad para interpretar la consigna como sea posible. Tenemos por un lado, el doctor Eamonn Butler, al doctor Tom Palmer y al doctor Walter Castro. Los voy a ir presentando a medida que vaya hablando cada uno. We will start in English. So as I was saying, this is going to be a panel on the current state of global liberalism or regional liberalism or local liberalism, whatever case is that you decide to discuss. You can discuss countries, political parties, intellectual debates, where there's some sort of debate on the meaning of liberty and liberalism. Or you can discuss the matter more abstractly without mentioning specific cases. It is up to you. We want you to be as free as you can to discuss whatever it is that you want to discuss. We will start with Dr. Eamonn Butler. He is an economist. He got his PhD from the University of St. Andrews and is now director of the Adam Smith Institute, which he also co-founded. He has authored several books, among them 40 Centuries of Wage and Price Controls, which we here in Argentina know very well. So welcome, Dr. Butler. It is a pleasure to have you here. Fundación Libertad welcomes you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I do hope my microphone is working properly and everything's in order. Good. You've given us a big canvas to paint on, so let me choose the biggest canvas, which is the world. Is the world getting more liberal or less liberal? I think that most liberals agree that the world has got rather less liberal in the last few years. And in fact, if you look at all of the indexes of human freedom and democracy, Freedom House, Reason, Cato, Fraser Institute, all of them say that liberal values have declined, particularly since the pandemic, but certainly overall since 5 years ago, 2017. Most of that, if you look at the numbers, is actually authoritarian regimes getting even more authoritarian. More states have moved from being relatively free to not free. Even India, for example, the world's biggest democracy, again, there you see intimidation against journalists and against human rights groups and so on. So that's an indication that something's going wrong there, because India otherwise is a pretty free sort of free-thinking country. If you look at the authoritarian governments, there have been even bigger crackdowns over the last few years in places like Russia, obviously, Belarus, and even, of course, in Hong Kong, very dear to my heart, as a former British territory. You can see in China, the biggest authoritarian state in the world, the amount of disinformation that's coming out, particularly about the origin of the virus, and some very bizarre claims being made as to where it might have arisen from, and blaming the Americans and things like this, which is just really rather silly. But also, of course, in China, throwing its weight around, threatening other states, saying that they're really the natural owners and colonists, if you like, of the South China Sea, funding governments around the world to get their support for China and against Western powers. So the authoritarian world has been getting more authoritarian, and it's been getting more bold. So that's the first point. The second point is that, of course, the prosecution of the virus is very much to part of this, if indeed liberalism is retreating. We've had lockdowns in many countries, very severe lockdowns in the East, for example, and in China and other countries in Asia. Even here in Europe, in places like Hungary, when lockdown and restrictions were introduced, Viktor Orban's government basically used those as a tool to oppress opponents and to take resources from towns that oppose the government and so on. Authoritarians have, I think, throughout the world, used the distraction of the West being distracted by the virus, and how you fight that. Particularly in a democratic world where you're actually supposed to do things by agreement rather than just forcing decisions on people, that authoritarians have used that distraction in the West in order to increase their authoritarianism even more. And now you've got the situation where, in what polling we can do, in what relatively free countries we can do polling, roughly half the world seems to be thinking that democracy, for example, is not very important, and that many people feel that what we really need is stronger government. We need a strong person, a strong government to lead us through difficult things like the pandemic and the economic situation that the world's in, and so on. So that does indicate, I think, that there's something wider going on. I think there is something wider going on. There's it's not just the virus. There's a general distrust of political systems, and that's been happening for some time. I think we've seen it here in Britain with our decision to leave the European Union. We've seen it in continental Europe with the rise of extremist parties of left and right. We've seen it in the United States with the election of Donald Trump. That's been happening for some time. And that's if you like, good news and bad news for liberals, because it indicates to me as a liberal that what's happened is that we've stretched democracy too far, that we've been told for so long that democracy is an absolutely wonderful system. And then people say, well, perhaps we should have more things decided democratically. And so now it comes to people's lifestyles have to be regulated by a democratic government, and the size of your Coca-Cola can is decided by some kind of political process. And that is stretching democracy too far. A liberal views democracy as a way of making collective decisions, and the least bad way of making collective decisions, but at the same time, very few decisions actually have to be made collectively. So if you start using democracy, which means using politics to decide every part of human life, well, it's not surprising that things go badly. And so you have a system which is grown up to be intrusive. The political system is everywhere in people's lives, and it's dysfunctional because democracy is something which just simply cannot carry that weight. It can only decide a few basic decisions that we can't decide in any other way. And that, I think, has led to, we've seen disruptions in trade, we've seen economic warfare, suspicion of foreign suppliers. All of these things, I think, has made people skeptical about the political process and its ability to get us out of terrible messes. Trouble is that those who are in power and have voted themselves all these controls in the COVID era rather like having more power. But the people in democracies, I think, I remain optimistic, because I think ordinary people are very committed to their own rights. And you can see the anti-lockdown feeling in Sweden, in the UK, in the US, Taiwan, many other places, where if people are allowed to criticize the establishment, they do criticize the establishment, and they say that, we don't want all of this authoritarian rule. We want to be safe, but at the same time, we actually want a free life. So it seems to me that I don't think there's, if you like, a long-term decline in liberal values. Liberal values are still pretty strong, but there's been a stalling of the process towards liberalism and towards democracy, particularly, I think, as trade has been gummed up a bit by the virus and by wars here and there, and so globalization is going rather more slowly than it has been in the past. And I think that when people are free to trade, then they understand their partners, and they trust people more, and they trust the other side more, and we get more trust throughout the world. So that's been a misfortune. But at the same time, I think that liberty is very resilient, and there's a lot of people in many countries of the world who do think that democracy is a good thing, who do think that liberalism is a good thing, and who, most importantly, simply want governments to get out of their lives so they can do their own thing. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Eamonn. I forgot to say at the beginning, we have quite some time. We have about 80 minutes left because we will run this until 1 p.m. Argentinian time. So please feel free to speak your mind on whatever it is that you want to discuss. Thank you, Eamonn, for this inaugural speech. We will now continue with Tom G. Palmer, who got his doctorate in politics from Oxford University and is now the George Yeager Chair for Advancing Liberty and Executive Vice President for International Programs at the Atlas Network, as well as a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute and the Director of the Cato University. So welcome, Tom. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcos, and thank you for the invitation to be with you. I listened in on the earlier panel, and with my limited Spanish, was able to follow the conversation. I'm in awe of how quickly Spanish speakers can think and speak. I think that the rest of us are not able to do that at the same time with the same facility. So I'm going to be a little bit more plodding and like a tortoise in my approach. So I want to start a little bit more abstractly than Eamonn's comments, which I think really got us off on a good footing. I like the title of this panel, Towards a Liberal Liberty, because it highlights the fact that liberty is an essentially contested concept, as the philosopher W.B. Galley put it. So there are a number of concepts that structure our political thinking and our political lives that most people lay claim to. And freedom or liberty, English is a bit odd in having two words for this concept, because English is basically two languages squished into one, Anglo-Saxon and French. Other languages usually have one word for it, so libertad. But it's something that most people claim that they're in favor of. There are not that many people, although there are some, who said, liberty, I'm against it. So you think about some of the fascist thinkers were against liberty explicitly, but most of them said, no, we're for liberty too. We just have a different idea of liberty than what the liberals believe in. So just like equality and fairness and justice, everyone says they're for those things, but it turns out when we work out the details, we're talking about very different conceptions of those important concepts. So take the concept of equality, for example. Most people, most political ideologies say, yes, we are in favor of equality. If you ask a liberal, what they mean is everyone should be equal before the law. That's the fundamental idea of equality. An egalitarian socialist might say everyone should have the same amount of wealth or the same income. That's a different conception. Fascists argue that, well, nations might be equal in some sense, but not that the individual members of those societies should be equal. So what is it that distinguishes the liberal conception of liberty from the others? And I think the core idea was articulated by Adam Smith. There's a presumption of liberty. That is to say, the burden of proof is on the person who would restrict your liberty, not on the person who would exercise it. You're not required to give an argument for why you should be allowed to do all the things you might do in the course of your life. Wear a hat or not wear a hat, take this job or that job. There's a presumption. You're free to do whatever you please with your life and with what is yours. And that, of course, is another conversation. What does property mean and what is legitimately one's own? The other perspective, which is shared, I would say, by all other political philosophies, is some version of the presumption of power. It is presumed that the state or some collective body or some hereditary monarchy has the power to compel you. And therefore, you have to give an argument why that shouldn't be the case. And liberals were the first to really turn that on its head and say, no, the one who wants to restrict your freedom is the one who should give an argument for it. You should be assumed to be free to do what you want. Now, it could be that there are cases where there's a good argument for why someone's freedom should be restricted. For example, you have the right to freedom of speech, but not perhaps with a loudspeaker right in front of my house at 2:30 in the morning, waking me up, for example. You have the freedom to bake a cake, but it could be that the way you do it emits sparks that set your neighbor's house on fire. That would be a good reason to restrict your exercise of that freedom. But the burden of proof is on the one who would restrict, not on the one who would exercise it. So that fundamental conception means an open understanding of society. We don't know what people will do with their freedom because they have their own ideas, their own minds, their own understanding of the world. It also means a humble view, and that's very important. All aspirants to political power assume they're the ones who are going to be in charge. So this is the typical phenomenon of what Lenin called the useful idiots, all the collectivists who advocated dictatorship and then found themselves lined up against the wall and shot. because they were threats to the one who managed to claw his way to the top. Everyone who's a collectivist assumes, well, of course, I'm going to be the one making the decisions for other people, not other people will be imposing decisions on me. Liberals are the ones who say, we're not sure what the best course of life is for other people. We don't know what the future is going to be like. So it's an inherently humble perspective. And that leads to a kind of a problem. And that is, how do you make humility sexy? Power and arrogance are sexy in a certain sense. They have a swagger, a machismo about them that you assume, yes, we know what the future ought to be. But when someone comes along and says, well, let's be humble, let's acknowledge other people have ideas also, that doesn't have the same kind of sexiness that the collectivist ideologies, whether they're right-wing or left-wing, typically carry. So we have a big challenge ahead of us in advancing liberty in the face of ideologies, each one of which says, we know what ought to be done. And we're the ones who say, we have an understanding of general principles of how government should be conducted, but we don't know what the future should be like. We don't have the blueprint or the cookie cutter to be able to stamp out what the freedom should be like. Now, Eamonn did mention that the trends have been in a negative direction, not just since 2017, actually for at least 12 years, I would say, since 2010. There has been, in general, a decline in liberty around the world. This has not been a good time. It's also been in some of the more advanced liberal democracies as well. We've seen accretions of governmental power during that time. I was reading The Economist today, and they had some pieces yesterday that were quite interesting. The first point was between 2010 and 2020, in wealthy countries, there was roughly a doubling of tariff restrictions on imports, a doubling in wealthy countries. This is a very negative development. And the idea of a future that is better, that can have growth, has been declining. They extracted data from what's called the Manifesto Project, which assembles political speeches and manifestos and documents from politicians in the OECD countries. And they found a decline in pro-growth sentiment, the idea that the future can be better and wealthier, and a 60% increase in anti-growth sentiment. And that's very disturbing, that it looks like a kind of closed future. And then finally, and this may account for some of the populist trends in recent years, a general global decline in economic growth rates. Now, this is a somewhat contested matter. It's not always easy to measure economic growth. Sometimes technological advances are just amazing and they don't show up in the growth statistics in the way that an increase in the number of houses and other things does. Things get incrementally better. That's also economic growth. But to the extent that they can measure it, they pointed out between 1980 and 2000, the average global growth was 2.5% annually. And since 2000, it's dropped to 1.1%. So there's been a decline in the economic growth rate overall. That's not good news. I think that we should focus on a pro-growth agenda and look at ways such as eliminating trade restrictions, which have been accumulating in recent years, in order to generate an optimistic sense of the future and real improvement in people's lives. Now, let me conclude, though, with a couple of thoughts. There's some good news. This trend towards populism that we've seen, and Eamonn mentioned the Trump phenomenon, and certainly many other countries, Brazil with Bolsonaro, and so on. Unfortunately, Lula also. But there has been some positive developments. And I think what happened in Peru, where Castillo was actually removed from office for attempting a coup d'etat, I think this should have happened in the United States as well. The Peruvians are to be congratulated for recognizing a coup d'etat and removing the aspiring dictator from office. But there's also been electoral defeats of populists in a number of countries. One of the ones that I think was most interesting, and there are many lessons here, is Greece. Greece had a coalition of extreme right and extreme left. Syriza, the coalition of the radical left, which is Maoist and Trotskyist, every kind of lunatic, crazy communist in one party, and the Panel Party, which is a nationalist, let's say, proto-fascist party in Greece, and they were in a coalition government. This is a kind of a nightmare, a red-brown coalition. But with the political leadership of the New Democracy Party and Kyriakos Mitsotakis, they won in 2019 and defeated this populist movement. Greece doesn't have a perfect government, unlike all the other countries in the world, but this has been a huge improvement, and they got a kind of normal, stable, democratic government in place in Greece. And there's some lessons to learn there of how you can defeat the populists in elections. And then lastly, I think that the horror that we are witnessing in Ukraine has made clear to many more people what is at stake. We have seen a liberal democratic system, very flawed, lots of problems. Everybody knows that. The Ukrainian system is by no means perfect, but it's an open society where you're not afraid all the time of the state. And they are now under attack and invasion from an increasingly totalitarian government, the Russian state. I think that shift from authoritarianism to totalitarianism is now essentially complete in Russia. There is no independent media, no freedom of speech. Not one newspaper is publishing in the country that dares to be critical of the government. All you have to do is use one word, war, and you can go to prison for 15 years. You have to say special military operation. And increasingly, the regime there is openly embracing fascist and National Socialist language of genocide. They use the most ugly racial slurs to refer to the Ukrainians and others as well. And this has put the choice so starkly and has brought people, particularly in Europe, but I also know in many other countries as well, to a deeper appreciation of how important liberal democracy is and why it is worth fighting for. Lastly, then, the Russian state has emerged as a center of illiberalism. It has been taken over by National Socialism. I mean, let's just call it exactly what it is. The Nazi philosophy has now triumphed in the Kremlin. There are Nazi philosophers such as Alexander Dugin, who are very popular promoting this view. If you watch Russian television, it's astonishingly brutal, the language that they use of racial collectivism and militarism and nationalism to advance their agenda. And they are broadcasting this around the world. We have discovered that many of the far left and far right parties, both of them, any anti-liberal party, you can typically find some connection to the Kremlin. Money trails of financing, and of course, social media manipulation through huge troll farms that are maintained by Yevgeny Prigozhin and others who are close to the Kremlin. And then the Chinese state also has been promoting illiberalism globally in a rather different way, a bit more focused on what are perceived to be Chinese national concerns, whereas the Kremlin's illiberalism is against liberalism per se, everywhere, always, for everyone. A bit different from the approach of Xi Jinping's state. But what has happened is more people are aware of what is at stake right now. And my last point, we need to recognize that the triumph of liberty, of liberal liberty, is not inevitable. We have to fight for it. There are people fighting on the front lines for it in Ukraine against a genocidal invasion. The rest of us can fight for it in newspapers, in debates, radio and television, and social media to advance our ideas. That means we need to understand illiberal thought better. We need to read their texts, understand what motivates them, engage with them, and try to help people to understand that this is a false promise, that the liberty and equality and fairness and justice that are offered by these totalitarian philosophies will, in fact, produce the opposite of what they had hoped for. And I should put in a little plug. Eamonn Butler's books are wonderful at this. They're so good at explaining the ideas of freedom clearly and concisely. They're wonderful primers, and I hope that people will rush out right now and get Eamonn's books. They're in English. Many of them are already in Spanish and other languages as well. And I really salute him for his work of engaging in the battle for ideas.
Thank you, Tom. We were actually just talking about books and authors that we liked as liberals in our previous panel, which will be available after the conference is done, but also about those who we don't like, who we need to understand in order to improve ourselves as liberals.
That's right.
So, I will now switch to Spanish. Tenemos a nuestro último panelista del día, de este panel, porque después vamos a terminar alrededor de la 1 de la tarde de Argentina, así que después de que hable vamos a tener una ronda de nuevos comentarios y preguntas, pero antes que eso les presento a un invitado de la casa, al doctor Walter Castro, que es economista, doctor en economía por SADE, director de asuntos académicos de la Fundación Libertad y profesor de la Universidad Nacional de Rosario, de la Universidad Católica Argentina. Bienvenido, Walter.
Hola, Marcos, ¿cómo estás? Muchas gracias por permitirme participar de este panel, muy honrado de poder compartir algunas ideas y conversar un rato de la libertad, del liberalismo, de la salud que la libertad y el liberalismo tienen. La presentación que voy a hacer va a tener 3 tramos. Diría uno para tratar de definir un poco el concepto de libertad, respecto del cual vamos a estar hablando, introductorio. El segundo ya tiene un carácter más de provocación, ¿no? De interpelación, en el sentido no de provocación para bajar un acerto, sino justamente para que pensemos un poco sobre los temas, no una interpelación ni una provocación en un sentido categórico, sino de generar dudas a propósito de la profundidad del concepto de libertad y de sus amenazas, de los riesgos que hay alrededor de él. Y la conclusión, un poco más breve, por supuesto, va a tener que ver sobre la salud de la libertad y el liberalismo, ¿no? Entonces, rápidamente, y para ponernos en sintonía, a propósito de lo que estamos hablando, un rápido repaso, muy a la carrera y muy desprevenido, sobre la cuestión de la libertad y del liberalismo, ¿no? Yo arrancaría por situarme en la libertad, en el concepto de la libertad de los modernos, ¿no? Para empezar por un punto, o sea, ese espacio de autonomía de la voluntad para definir nuestro propio plan felicitario y poner nuestros medios a disposición de ese esfuerzo individual de cada uno de ser feliz a su manera sin embromar al de al lado. Ese sería... Bueno, hay, por supuesto, un concepto de isonomía, ¿no? De igualdad ante la ley para que cada cual tenga ese espacio de autonomía. Y para eso la regla, la ley universal o la ley moral de justicia del orden, formulada en un sentido general, para los liberales es un conjunto de muy poquitas prohibiciones: no matar, no robar, no estafar, de cuño moral, que es lo que delimitan esos espacios de gran autonomía de la libertad que anhelamos. Entonces, en síntesis, tirando una línea, el liberalismo del fondo sería esa búsqueda continua por mayores grados de libertad dentro del orden para que los individuos puedan florecer y desarrollarse individualmente a su manera, ¿no? Bueno, desde esta perspectiva, insisto, de libertad moderna, a mí me parece acá sí importante subrayar 3 conceptos el liberalismo como un orden social debe pensarse como un orden extenso y en permanente extensión. La segunda palabra que siento que en algún sentido a veces nos sustraen, nos roban, es la inclusión. Un orden extenso incluye a la mayor cantidad de individuos del orden y más y más y más a escala global. Y el tercer asunto es la diversidad, porque a medida que vamos metiendo gentes de otras culturas y otras maneras personales de ensayar vivir sus vidas felizmente, estamos cargando de riqueza al orden a partir de la diversidad. Entonces, extensión, inclusión y diversidad son palabras de nuestro léxico. Por supuesto, competencia y reglas fair play también lo soy. Entonces, en competencia y reglas fair play hay creatividad, innovación, todo florece. Y por supuesto también en términos económicos eso ocurre cuando la especialización, la división del trabajo, la capitalización generan más bienes para satisfacer más necesidades. Este sería el combo de lo que nosotros planteamos. Bueno, históricamente esto se dio, por supuesto, no sé, para ir a la carrera, habrá sido el Renacimiento italiano, habrá sido después la extensión a los Países Bajos, habrá sido el comercio interoceánico, atlántico, la revolución industrial, las revoluciones que empujaron por más grados de libertad, la revolución gloriosa, ¿okay? Todos estos sucesos muy importantes en términos históricos tienen un trasfondo moral y sociológico muy importante, y esto también lo subrayo porque es, como dice Adam Smith, pasar del campo a la ciudad, o como Hayek dice, pasar de la tribu a la sociedad abierta, ¿no? Entonces ese paso a la gran sociedad es el paso de la Edad Media a la modernidad, esa es la libertad de los modernos, de eso estamos hablando, y ahí cambia jurídicamente porque se terminó el mandato y viene el contrato. La sociedad deja de ser vertical y pasa, o comienza a ser más horizontal, no hay una finalidad única de la tribu y un jefe, sino que hay miles, millones de planes individuales, y entonces se concerta un orden de cooperación, de respeto, porque el respeto es lo que gobierna y ya no la lealtad al jefe o a la idea de la tribu, esa única idea que si no escribías a ello era un traidor y tenía que ser excluido. Ese cambio moral es muy profundo, ese cambio sociológico es muy profundo y por supuesto reclama explicaciones teóricas, tanto políticas como económicas, y entonces obviamente el límite al gobierno es lo que destrona el absolutismo, el Estado de Derecho por arriba de la cabeza del gobernante, los debidos procesos y, por supuesto, la división de los poderes y todo eso que tiene que ver con nuestro formato constitucional republicano y democrático en materia política. Y en materia económica, bueno, el comercio, la libertad de comercio es división de trabajo, eso es especialización, eso es productividad, eso es ahorro, eso es competencia libre, eso es capitalización y eso es bienestar. Entonces, esas ideas políticas y económicas vienen corriendo en paralelo y concomitantemente a semejante cambio histórico, moral y sociológico, ¿no? Bueno, nada nuevo hasta ahí. Sin embargo, y acá para terminar la parte introductoria, bueno, el precio de la libertad es su eterna vigilancia. Entonces ahí hay una advertencia que está bien formulada alrededor de esto, ¿no? Es decir, el precio de la libertad es su eterna vigilancia, hay un deber que hacer, hay un pendiente, hay un volver a la libertad de los antiguos. Bueno, ok. Ahora, en este segundo tramo, yo quiero hacer algunas provocaciones para pensar un poco más profundamente esa idea de libertad, ¿no? O esas ideas de libertad que son sumamente importantes, pero para mí insuficientes. Insuficientes a la hora de defender la libertad y a la hora de pensar en la salud de la libertad. Porque cualquier relato histórico del nacimiento del liberalismo, cualquier teoría política, cualquier teoría económica, es una idea, y para mí la libertad no es una idea, es un valor. Y esto es un poquito distinto, y acá va la provocación, una idea encarnada es un valor, una idea encarnada en el corazón de las personas, una idea que merece ser vivida, una idea que merece ser defendida, una idea que le da sentido a nuestra vida. No es solo una idea, una página de libro, una discusión académica. Y los valores, además de, por supuesto, justificarse en principios éticos y en muy buenas explicaciones de por qué las cosas son más justas, o que, además de esa justificación intelectual, se transmiten, por ejemplaridad. Entonces, la idea sola por sí, escrita, bien escrita, muy bien, necesario, pero hace falta el ejemplo en quienes promueven esas ideas. Este es un primer punto. Una segunda provocación es que todas las constituciones tienen un conjunto de libertades, en la nuestra, en el artículo 18, 19, libertad de transitar, libre expresión, libertad de comercio, bueno, debido proceso, etcétera, etcétera. Son libertades de las que las personas gozamos en un régimen constitucional de libertades, pero el foco para la defensa de la libertad no es en el promedio de libertades de las que gozamos, sino que es marginal, es en el margen. O sea, la libertad que me parece a mí debe ocuparnos es esa libertad a la que le pones la lupa, que es la libertad de la minoría. La libertad de la minoría expresada en su sentido ínfimo, que es la libertad del individuo, ¿no? La minoría más chiquitita, el individuo. Y el individuo es siempre, un sujeto marginal. Está en el margen. Ese es el que nos importa, no el tipo promedio, el tipo diverso, el tipo variado, el tipo que promueve cambio. Ese es la libertad del débil, del vulnerable. El liberalismo siempre se preocupó por la libertad de esa clase de personas, porque justamente quiere extender el orden, ¿no? A los excluidos. Bueno, entonces, esa libertad es la que cuenta. A ampliar la frontera de la libertad es incluir gente que está fuera del sistema. Entonces, esa lectura de la libertad marginal, digo marginal, me gusta muchísimo la palabra, porque yo me siento definitivamente un marginal en casi todo lo que hago. 99,9% de todo lo que hago lo hago mal. No sé manejar tecnología, por supuesto no sé fabricar tecnología, no entiendo de los remedios que tomo, no soy capaz ni de entretenerme por mí mismo, que tengo que aprender Netflix todo el tiempo. Uno se siente muy limitado comparado a la cantidad de cosas a las que accede, y justamente esa es la ventaja del orden de la cooperación, el orden del respeto, el orden de la libertad, es acceder al conocimiento de los demás, es acceder al esfuerzo de los demás en un sistema de reglas justas y de competencia, valernos del aporte de todos los otros en un jardín muy florido. Entonces, ese orden de libertad, hecho para gente antropológicamente muy insuficiente, como somos todos nosotros, o como creo bueno, esto dicho con perdón de los orgullosos y de los arrogantes, digo, mi manera de ver es esa, muy humilde de lo que cada hombre solito puede hacer. Ahora, en un orden de libertad es muchísimo lo que se puede conseguir a partir del respeto y de la voluntad de cada uno por ser mejor. Ahora, ahí viene, y ya para terminar de plantear el desafío más concretamente, decir, bueno, está bien, pero ¿y qué decía Tocqueville? Bueno, que cuando el orden concede tantas ventajas y cuando el árbol está con sus manzanas tan grandes, hay una tentación grande de sentarse abajo del árbol, comerse las manzanas y olvidarnos de regar las raíces morales que le dan fundamento a ese orden de crecimiento y de respeto. O sea, atrás de esto hay un fundamento moral, una razón ética que lleva a ese compromiso que hace falta. Entonces, la última provocación de este segundo tramo es un test que a mí siempre me gusta hacer, porque todos estamos dispuestos a defender nuestra libertad de expresión, nuestra libertad de comercio, etcétera, 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 pero el test es cuántos de nosotros estamos dispuestos a defender la libertad de expresión de otro, y de otro que piensa distinto de nosotros. Y eso me parece un buen test. ¿Sí? A ver, ¿cuánto pones vos de vos, cuánto arriesgas vos para defender la libertad de expresión de uno que va a decir lo contrario que vos dirías? O planteado lo mismo, de otra manera, como pasa en Venezuela, aunque ¿cuánta gente pondría el pellejo propio? ¿Cuánto pondría el patrimonio propio para defender la libertad o el patrimonio de otros que están siendo oprimidos o arrasados, de una minoría que está siendo aplastada por un gobierno de turno? Es decir, ¿cuánto de uno pone, cuánto uno arriesga en lo personal de eso? O dicho en términos mercantilistas, pensando en la Argentina, donde los privilegios acá se reparten, los privilegios se reparten legalmente, todo está codificado y con casilleros para que cada cual pueda sacar su sortija. Entonces, ¿cuántos de nosotros estamos dispuestos a renunciar a un privilegio que va en desmedro de otros en un mundo donde todos tienen su privilegio, todos tienen su cuota de reparto más grande, más chica, discrecional por parte del gobierno? Si mira, la igualdad de la ley obliga a que el primer privilegio ilegítimo que vos tengas, por más que sea legal, lo renuncies. Bueno, es un buen test del liberal y de paladar negro. Se dan cuenta que no es tan fácil ser liberal y arriesgar lo propio para defender la libertad por principio, porque por conveniencia cualquiera la defendería, pero por principio, es decir, imparcialmente las libertades de todos los demás. Entonces, frente a ese test, uno dice, bueno, y la salud de la libertad, así que depende en el margen de la defensa de la libertad de los más vulnerables, de los más frágiles, de los que son más diversos, de los que son minoría, de los que están siendo aplastados porque no son comprendidos, ¿no? Digo, ¿no está en riesgo? Bueno, y entonces, hecho este planteo a propósito de la salud del liberalismo, voy a dar ya prácticamente aproximándome al final alguna suerte de aproximación a lo que yo creo, ¿no? Que no sé si es una conclusión, pero la amenaza más importante que hay atrás del liberalismo es el miedo. El miedo. El miedo. O sea, el miedo hace volver a la gente a la tribu, hace tratar de que cada persona se vuelva al seno materno, al regazo, a pedir un lugar calentito. Entonces, ante el miedo, la gente se inmoviliza y se guarda. ¿Y dónde se guarda? Bueno, se guarda en su familia, en su comunidad, en su tribu. El segundo asunto que me parece muy desafiante hoy, ya que en el panel pasado estuvieron hablando de ficción, digo la actualidad, el vértigo de la actualidad. Casi desintegrado la ciencia ficción. O sea, cuando yo era chico se leía Julio Verne, el submarino era toda una gran idea que pasaría 50 años después. El viaje a la Luna se soñaba, pero iba a ser 100 años después, qué sé yo. Hoy día la realidad va a tal velocidad que te sorprende todos los días con cosas que no te imaginaste antes. Entonces, la cantidad de decisiones que tomamos, la cantidad de opciones que tenemos, justamente gracias a la multiplicación de los servicios, de los bienes, de la cooperación, es tan grande que, bueno, si el liberalismo es decidir y alguien tiene miedo de asumir riesgo en un mar de tremenda incertidumbre, bueno, ese miedo a hacerse responsable y decidir por uno mismo tal vez crece. Y la pandemia nos da un enorme ejemplo del miedo, de la incertidumbre, ¿no? De esa responsabilidad individual que... No. Entonces, ¿qué hizo el mundo? Se metió en su casa, delegó buena parte del poder a alguien que lo concentró, que era el gobierno, llamó a sus expertos, ahí estaban los sabios para explicar cómo había que organizar esto, bajaron una serie de regulaciones y para tratar de asegurar la vida de todos en igualdad de condiciones, se empezaron a emitir cheques que repartían para que cada cual esté tranquilo en su casa. Sí, bueno, caramba, qué mejor ejemplo que lo que vivimos para darnos cuenta de la amenaza que siempre va a estar con la libertad, porque el ser humano tiene miedo, porque no siempre asume su responsabilidad, porque no siempre toma riesgo, porque no siempre quiere ejercer su libertad, porque no todo el mundo es liberal. Y esas fuerzas que cierran el orden están en competencia permanente con las que se hacen imprescindibles para abrir el orden. Entonces, volviendo y ya terminando, ¿no? Digo, hace falta un compromiso moral, ético, si ustedes quieren, de personas que declaman la idea de libertad y que hay muy buenas ideas y muy buenas teorías, pero que ejercen su libertad, que dan ejemplo defendiendo la libertad. Y no son tantas, que defienden la libertad por principio más que por interés, es decir, de manera universal. Y esa llamita es la que ha hecho conquistar la libertad en muchas batallas. Porque cuando yo digo la libertad es marginal, es que la libertad se conquista y se pierde cada día en el borde. No las grandes libertades que ya están consagradas, sino las por venir, que son los nuevos desafíos que someten a las poblaciones de todo el mundo, a los individuos, a saber si quieren ser más libres o no, si se animan un poco más o no, si puede ser más respetuoso de la dignidad, de los patrimonios y de la manera de vivir la vida diversa que cualquier persona sobre la Tierra puede tener, siempre y cuando no haga un daño al otro. Esa idea de tolerancia, de apertura. Si esa llama de libertad está encendida, el liberalismo goza de buena salud. Porque el liberalismo, antes de ser una teoría política, una teoría económica, un raconto histórico, fue un sentimiento revulsivo, un sentimiento de repugnancia ante la injusticia, de una sociedad estratificada, cerrada, con sangre azul y sangre roja, con monarcas absolutos, con gente que daba órdenes, con sabios que trataban a todo el resto de idiotas. Hasta que el individuo, el genio, salió de la botella. Finalmente, con la libertad de mercado y las democracias, encontramos nuestro lugar. La clase media tiene su lugar en el mundo, pero si no nos encargamos de defenderla con el trasfondo ético que permitió todas estas cosas y que hizo por un sentimiento de justicia que la libertad se ampliara, entonces ese día sí el liberalismo trae problemas. Muchas gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Walter, por tus palabras iniciales. I will switch back to English to ask a couple of questions. I will now most likely ask questions for all three of you, but I want to get started with a question to Tom and Eamonn regarding what Walter was just discussing, which is at the end, he was talking about moral examples and that we need moral examples within liberalism because it is easy to enjoy our own liberty, but it's not that easy to fight for others. And he was asking himself, how many of us are willing to defend the liberties of others? How many of us are willing to give up our money or renounce our privileges in fighting to expand this sphere of liberty? So what do Eamonn and Tom, I wonder, think about this regarding our own people? Where are liberals on this across the globe? What do you think from outside of Argentina on liberals? Are we up to our label, let's say? Would we be willing to fight for others as liberals, even if that means not being as comfortable as we are now? I don't know who wants to start, Tom or Eamonn.
Why don't I take a crack with a thought from a very inspiring Brazilian liberal, so next door at Greater Argentina, as some people call it, and that was Joaquim Nabuco, who struggled for the liberty of enslaved Brazilians. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to eliminate slavery in 1888. And in his book on abolitionism, he stated the liberal creed very clearly. He said, educate yourself, educate your children in the love for the freedom of others. For only when you love the freedom of other people will you truly appreciate your own and have the courage to defend it. And I've taken that to heart. I think that really captures the liberal mentality very well. Most people are able to defend their own personal freedom and the understanding of what they want to do. But to defend the freedom of other people, people who are different from you, have a different religion, different ethnic identity, different language, do different things. So as a small example, I don't smoke marijuana. It's now legal where I live in Thailand. So you smell it on the street sometimes. I have no interest in it. I don't like to be around it. But I have worked for decades for legalization because I believe it's wrong to put other people in a cage because they smoke something that I don't like, or they grow a plant in their house for their consumption, or they traffic in it. It's just wrong. And I've spent a lot of time working on that. And now we're winning in many countries around the world on this cause. And it was because people who don't smoke marijuana were also willing to stand up for the freedom of those who do. That may seem a trivial example compared to religious oppression and so on, but it's important. It doesn't matter that whether you do it or not. It's the question of whether it's right that people be punished for that. Everyone should have the freedom to do that. And I should mention, in Ukraine, we have seen people come from all around the world. And when I have been there, I talked to people from Poland, from Sweden, from Germany, from Argentina, from Mexico, who went to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians because they really believed in the struggle for freedom. It wasn't that it was just some adventure. They went and did really hard work, and some people put their lives on the line, and a number of those people have been killed because they were fighting for the freedom of other people. So I think that is at the core of liberalism, whether it's in an everyday context in your own country or something as dramatic as this invasion we have seen in Ukraine. And the last point, an old friend of mine, long gone, was a Ford car dealer in the United States. He sold Ford cars made in America. Every year he flew to Washington at his own expense to lobby against trade restrictions on foreign competitors because he said, I'm in the car business. If my cars are not good enough, the customers will go buy someone else's, and that's their right. And he was a very powerful champion of free trade in doing that. People said, how can you do that? It's against your interest. He said, no, because my deeper interest is living in a free country. That's my deepest interest, not whether I'm going to buy or sell this particular thing or make money. So I think that this point that Walter has raised is profoundly important.
Yes, I think the Ukraine example is a very powerful one. The amount of concern that has been elicited throughout the world, and the number of people who simply wanted to contribute. I mean, here I am in the UK, and when the war broke out, clearly there was a need for blankets and clothing and other things like that. So we loaded up the car with spare things, and we went down to the local Polish church, and they were saying, "No, sorry, we can't take any more. Everybody is giving us clothes. We haven't got enough vans to go to Ukraine." So it was remarkable how ordinary people got engaged in that. And as Tom said, it wasn't because there was some adventure going on. It was simply because they saw these are relatively free people who are being oppressed and bullied by people who want to prevent their freedoms. And I think that has been very deep. And even if you look at the governments aren't a good measure of these things, but even if you look at the government assistance that's gone into Ukraine from around Europe in particular, but around the world, We are in Western Europe doing things that cost us in order to help Ukraine. We are prepared to pay higher prices for gas or not import gas from Russia. Yes, I mean, people are prepared to make sacrifices, and I think that this has been an extremely good example. I think looking on a smaller scale, I think that one of the trouble is that the state, if you like, crowds out ordinary moral activity that we used to have. We still have to some extent, but we used to have a much stronger civil society, churches and philanthropic organizations. And people simply getting together and doing their own thing. I mean, for example, in the United Kingdom, we used to have before the Second World War, before the welfare state reforms after the Second World War, we had what was in effect a working class welfare system where relatively poor people would pay in premiums into what was called a friendly society. And that would take care of their health care, and it would take care of, if they were unemployed, it would pay them benefits and so on. And everybody was a member of that scheme. And it was very efficient because there were lots of different friendly societies, and they all worked in different ways. And to some extent, they competed against each other, and they kept their costs down. And because it was a small scale thing, you were a member of your local society. You could choose whatever society you wanted, but you felt that you were a member of something, so you didn't exploit it. I mean, it's not like modern day welfare where if there's a benefit going, that's fine, I'll take 6. People just exploit the system, and to some extent they make themselves worse off in order that they qualify for state benefit. So you've got the state there crowding out ordinary welfare. And I think, even these days, if you see somebody, I don't know, beating up another person in the street, do you get involved? Well, I think a lot of people think, well, the police should be doing something about that. The officials should be doing something about that. The local government should be doing something about that. It's not my responsibility. And I think that the state, therefore, has crowded out this local philanthropy, local fellow feeling, local welfare, and civil society. I think one thing I do feel is that it's a lot easier to be generous to people if you're fairly well off. If you are Dale Carnegie and you can, Andrew Carnegie rather, and you can, you've sold a steel mill and you can use your money to build libraries around the world as he did in the 19th century. Wealthier societies tend to be more philanthropic. America gives twice as much to charity as we do in the UK, largely because America is a richer country. And so I think much of what we've got to do is actually make the world rich. And then I think that we will actually be looking after each other very much better because we're rich and we can afford to do so. If you're poor, it's a lot harder. So I think those are the points I would reflect on this.
Thank you, Eamonn. Thank you, Tom. I have many questions, some more general, some more abstract. Let's start with the specific one, because Eamonn was discussing back when he started the COVID-19 pandemic, right? In the past 3 years, maybe not 2022, but definitely 2020 and 2021 have been marked by the pandemic. And just when it seems it's all over, it creeps back into our lives. So my question to you, to all three of you, is what happened with liberalism during the pandemic? Do you think our approaches to fighting coronavirus damaged liberalism? Do you think these approaches in the Western world, of course, reflected the virtues of our liberalism, or maybe its problems, or maybe its absence? I don't know who wants to start.
I think emergencies are different. I think you can be a liberal, but equally believe that in an emergency, you've got to do something else. And maybe you do actually have to compel people to do certain things. Maybe you have to scrap some democratic procedures and just, get the decisions made quickly. Many of the decisions we did make were wrong, but as we now know, but there you are. But the thing about an emergency is it has to be an emergency. It can't go on forever. And in Greece and Rome, for example, they would levy taxes when there are emergencies, but they had to stop after 6 months or something. And I think in Greece, that was the rule. So I think we've sort of lost sight of that. Yes, it's okay if you're a liberal. It's okay to have a non-liberal solution to an emergency, but for goodness sake, make sure that expires after a certain period.
I'll defer to Walter to get his thoughts first.
Ok. En mi impresión, la pandemia dejó algunas lecciones muy impresionantes. En Argentina, nosotros tenemos algunos casos bastante confusos a propósito de muertes de personas encarceladas en situaciones muy extrañas por policías provinciales. Un caso en San Luis, un caso en Tucumán, ambos fueron públicos. Personas que fueron detenidas porque estaban violando la prohibición de transitar en pandemia. También tuvimos el caso en Santiago del Estero, un papá que quiso entrar con su hija a su pueblito en Santiago del Estero, que venía de una atención de salud por una enfermedad terminal fuera de Santiago del Estero, y no lo dejaron ingresar en su auto. Tuvo que ingresar con la nena al hombro varios kilómetros. Tuvimos otros ejemplos tremendos y muy increíbles de una señora de 60 años que quería tomar sol en la plaza con su reposera solo y la policía la quería encarcelar. Y hasta un helicóptero persiguió a un remero en el río porque se supone que era contagioso. Entonces, yo nunca he visto cosas más ridículas y tan peligrosas y tan dañinas como esta que acabo de mencionar en pandemia. La libertad de esos marginales me refiero. Cuando sale el remero a remar y el helicóptero lo persigue con un megáfono y la sociedad no dice nada, cada uno de nosotros no dice nada. O con la gente que acusa al que salía a tomar sol a la plaza para que el gobierno lo meta adentro con la policía. Y no veo ninguna organización de derechos humanos en Argentina seguir investigando las causas de las personas, de la chica en San Luis o de la persona en Tucumán, que por resistirse a la autoridad fueron presos y aparecieron sin vida después, suicidados. También me da tremenda preocupación que cualquier emergencia haga que nosotros nos repleguemos, deleguemos el poder y el control absolutamente de alguien que se supone muy sabio y con armas para imponernos una solución de ese calibre me parece altamente riesgoso.
Tom?
Well, I would start out with a little shout out to an organization in the United Kingdom called the Adam Smith Institute. I think did a really good job in the context of the United Kingdom, that if there were to be restrictions, they should be clear, they should be as less restrictive as possible. That's not very good English, but that if you need a restriction, you put the minimal one that will do the job, and then also to find ways to increase freedom of people to avoid the virus. So they allowed restaurants to do takeaway without requiring some extra licensing procedure. If you can cook food and sell it, people can take it away. That was put in to allow people to dine outside, to do business outside, to sell clothes outside where there was circulation of air and so on. And I think that they really helped the Brits to get it right after a rather rocky start at the beginning. The problem with this pandemic was we didn't exactly know the nature of the disease. Was it the Black Death that killed half the population of Europe, or was it a really bad flu? And in that context, we can't expect decision-making to always be exactly right on. And we have identified a lot of mistakes and foolish policies that were implemented at the time. A very dear friend of mine, whom I admire tremendously, complained during the early days. He said, it's as if they're making up the rules as they go along. I said, well, that's what happens when you're learning about the threat as you're experiencing it. It's not like everybody knew how this disease was spread at the beginning. We learned later on. So in this context, I think that a lot of mistakes were made, some excessive restrictions, and there are some people, we have seen them in most countries, who love the idea of the restrictions per se and wanted to keep them essentially forever. The Chinese model, which is now breaking down before our eyes. Those people need to be restricted. Eamonn is certainly quite right that they needed to be understood as emergency measures, explicitly limited in time, and then requiring a democratic review as to whether they would be continued or not. So I don't think that you throw liberalism out when there's an emergency. It still is the background condition. But yes, sometimes we'll do things that under normal conditions we wouldn't. For example, restrictions on very large congregations of people that become super spreader events. In South Korea, most of the cases initially were traced to one, let's call it evangelical church meeting, in which their church kisses and hugs everyone. You had thousands of people kissing and hugging each other in a religious experience. Then they all went home and they took the virus to every corner of the country. Well, restricting those kinds of gatherings might be legitimate during this period. We don't normally restrict those things, but in this time period, it might be legitimate. Other restrictions went simply too far and were absurd and ridiculous. If you compare Sweden, which was relatively loose restrictions, with other countries, they did better. On the other hand, people forget the Swedes are not naturally gregarious people. They don't come in together, big clusters of people like other nationalities do. And there was a great deal of self-regulation. And then finally, when we look at the critics who have gone back and said what was done right and what incorrectly, much of the economic restrictions were not imposed by the government. Look at the data in the United States on restaurant and hotel reservations and airline travel. They all went way down before there was any governmental restriction at all. This was people regulating themselves, saying, I'm not going to fly now. We don't know what's out there. Let's not go out to dinner like we used to. Let's not go pub hopping and going to bars and so on. That happened voluntarily. It also had a negative economic consequence for people in all of those businesses. But those were decisions that were not just imposed by the state. They were actually implemented by people regulating their own lives. So it's going to be many years for us to go back and look through what went right and what went wrong and to draw lessons from it. But I think that liberalism has managed to come through the experience of the pandemic still with its flag held high.
I don't know if anyone wants to add another comment before I go on.
No, I on just one very specific thing of that Tom mentioned, easing the regulations on bars and restaurants in the UK. We've still got those easements. You know, you can still dine on the pavement and in a more sort of European cafe style than we were ever used to able to before, because there was a law against it. So we have actually benefited in one or two ways from those opening up of those restrictions. It's strange.
All right. So Eamonn was talking earlier about how liberal values are overall still pretty strong, according to him. Tom was saying that liberty is not usually contested, although, of course, different people give the word liberty different meanings. And for some reason, I thought, as you were talking, of a piece of news from a couple of days ago that doesn't have to do with authoritarian regimes or the pandemic. and it's the fact that New Zealand will be banning the sale of cigarettes to all those who are born after 2009. And we usually take New Zealand as an example of a working liberal democracy. So my question is, what is going on there? I also ask this because these days I've been rereading Spencer's Man Against the State, and for all his controversy, I wonder if his warning that liberals increasingly seek regulation is still valid over 100 years later. If we haven't succeeded in convincing those who say that they believe in liberty of actually working for it. So I wonder if any of you want to jump in on that.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Yes, this is shocking and stupid in my opinion, and deeply illiberal. I would say the following. I grew up when smoking was everywhere. People smoked on airplanes. You went into restaurants, and when you left, you just smelled like a cigarette. And I have benefited as a non-smoker from being in smoke-free places. Some of those restrictions were imposed by the state, and many were not. Many were just people saying, we're tired of that, and various restaurants and so on saying can't come in, eat our food, and smoke at the same time. It's hard to taste good food when people are smoking around you. But nonetheless, if people want to smoke on their own, I don't feel any need to stop them or to use the power of the state. New Zealand is an interesting case of a society that has gone through waves of restrictionism and liberty. So they went through, under the National Party, a highly restrictive, extremely statist set of policies. Interestingly enough, under the Labour Party, they liberalized. It was the Labour Party that began opening up New Zealand's economy and society. Then the National Conservatives switched back, became a little more liberal with Ruth Douglas as their finance minister. And now they've gotten a very collectivistic Labour Party leadership in coalition with a far-right party. One of the horrors of New Zealand is that you have the New Zealand First, I believe that's the name, party, which is a protectionist, nationalistic party in coalition with Labour, and they're getting a raft of just terrible, terrible policies. I do hope that the Liberals there, under the ACT Party and also scattered among the other political parties, will be able to turn that back. But it is an example of how we don't take things for granted. Liberal regimes can be unwound by wacky ideologues, and I think that's a legitimate description of the current Prime Minister of New Zealand. And we need to look out for that. The weird thing, the authentically weird thing, is how many people who want to restrict cigarettes and vaping believe in legalizing pot. And my view is, how does that work? How do you get to that position that the drug you like should be legal and the drug you don't like should be illegal? But that's where we are with many people. I don't smoke any of those things, and I want them all to be legal for people to enjoy in their own ways as they want to, so long as they don't come into my house and smoke it up.
Yeah, me too. I have to say, I'm a non-smoker. I do actually have the occasional cigar occasionally, I must say, but I'm really a non-smoker. But I fight for the rights of those who do want to smoke. The thing I find most concerning is things like as you mentioned, vaping, and vaping weans people off cigarettes. It's really useful in that regard. And the more vaping you have, the fewer people smoke cigarettes. And yet, many countries, European Union and so on, are trying desperately to kill vaping and just make it illegal, or make it that you have to get a doctor's certificate to buy this stuff. And there's something very strange going on here. And I think it is that the liberal mind is prepared to work through some complexities. that, you know, we believe in a free economy. Well, we believe in a free economy because if you look at it, that actually we're all curiously better off if we allow people free commerce and so on. You don't have to plan in order to produce an orderly society, for example, but you've got to work through those cerebral processes to work out what's going on. And I think that it is also true of this, where governments and pressure groups try to do us good by telling us what is good for us and what we must do. And so you've got taxes on sugar or sugary drinks, and you've got restrictions on tobacco, and certain restrictions even on the advertising and sale of alcohol. And it seems to me there's nothing more oppressive than to restrict somebody's behavior on the grounds that it's good for them. This is outrageous, because you can make up that anything is good for us and then say that there should be restrictions on it. So, you know, what I find remarkable is that people don't work through these things. They don't realize that, yes, let's actually make vaping liberal, because it'll get people off smoking cigarettes, and that's the real killer. Vaping is bad for you, but it's 100 times, roughly 50 or 100 times better for you than smoking cigarettes. So let's encourage people to do that. And in this country, we can't even, what we want to do in this country, in the UK, is to put advertisements for vapes in cigarette packets. But we're not even allowed to do that, because that's supposed to be advertising tobacco products, which is illegal. So you think this is crazy. You know, if we really want to improve people's health, you know, don't do it by this sort of procedure. That has exactly the opposite effect. And very often when you make something illegal, it has a cachet, and young people in particular want to do more of it, and they'll find ways of doing it. And we've made cigarettes very expensive in the UK. But about a third of the cigarettes that are smoked in southern England come across the channel. They're smuggled in from other countries. So I think that I think what we've got to just say over and over again, that we need the evidence, guys, before you start restricting our freedom. You actually have to make the case, and you can't just do it because you think this is a good thing to do. You've got to have an argument as to why it's a good thing to do it, and you've got to think it through, not just think that, oh yes, it's obviously a good thing if we ban this.
En idéntica línea, el asunto no parece ser el daño que la externalidad provoca, que si uno le fuma al otro en la cara en un restaurante, en un avión, va de suyo que eso es agresivo y que no tiene ningún sentido de ser permitido, ¿no? Y de hecho la gente reclama que no le fumen en la cara, y eso. Ahora, ya cuando las cosas se van a prohibir un club de fumadores, donde todos se fuman entre sí en la cara, ya me parece un poco exagerado ir a esas legislaciones que prohíben a la gente fumar en clubes de gente que se dedica a fumar. Porque en esa pretensión de cuidarle la vida al que fuma y que es un idiota porque se está arruinando su propia vida, vamos a llegar al extremo, y siempre llevando el asunto al margen, a tratar de prohibir algún día el deporte de los alpinistas, o el deporte de riesgo de la gente que hace a la delta. Es decir, está tomando una probabilidad de riesgo al subir al Himalaya de morirse como mucha gente hace. Y bueno, si no se da cuenta que se puede dañar a sí mismo. Bueno, esa pretensión de prohibir la hamburguesa, la Coca-Cola, los fumadores que fumen y todo, va un poco más allá de cualquier externalidad. Y hay una tendencia enorme para tratar de advertir a la gente de su propia idiotez. Entonces, el gobierno dice, bueno, si usted fuma, sepa que esto le va a hacer mucho daño y tal y cual. A mí me parece que en igual sentido, si esa actitud fuera válida o legítima, cada vez que vayan a poner los votos en la democracia para que la gente elija, creo que estaría muy bueno poner una leyenda abajo que diga, oiga, señor votante, usted que es sonso, tenga cuidado porque en la democracia alguien puede manipularle. tenga cuidado del populismo. Es muy impresionante que el daño siempre lo hace la empresa y en el mercado nunca lo hace ninguna labor que esté legislada políticamente o gubernamentalmente. Hay una tendencia hoy muy marcada a pensar de que el mercado, o sea, el comercio entre las personas, el intercambio, el diálogo o cualquier actitud cataláctica es de uno en desmedro del otro. Esto es una cosa muy impresionante. Entonces, cuando alguien pretende saber lo que es justo, lo que es bueno y lo que es bueno para cada quien, entonces tiene la tentación de organizarle la vida a los demás y eso es lo que nosotros tenemos que advertir. Una cosa es discutir externalidades cuando efectivamente alguien le fuma al otro la cara en un restaurante y por supuesto hay mucho que decir al respecto, pero nada hay que decir cuando 3 fumadores tienen un club para prenderse sus cigarros y se hacen daño en los pulmones porque le da la gana. Esa es la puerta de entrada marginalmente a prohibiciones mayores que pueden llegar a restricciones alimenticias o de deportes o a saber hasta dónde a alguien se le ocurrirá legislar.
Thank you, Walter. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to pick up on something that Tom was discussing at the beginning when he was asking himself and giving his response as to how do you make the humility that is inherent in liberalism sexy? How do we make it more popular? And I wonder what Eamonn's and Walter's thoughts on this are.
It's not very easy, is it? Vote for me, I want to leave you alone. It's not really a great electoral slogan. I don't know. I think that pointing to innovation and the way the world is going, and that there is a greater variety of things going on, I think you can make some headway there. That you want diversity and that you want innovation and you want progress, and that a government can't do these things. A government basically has to get out of the way for these things to happen. I think that might be a plausible way of advancing this and making it happen. I think in particular, young people want that. They don't want the government to get in their way. They want to go out and do their own thing and make $1 million by the age of 30. That's what they want to do. Let's play to that sentiment that we do want people to do their own thing, and we actually want government to get out of the way. So I think the message is that government actually occupies too much of your life, and that you can look after yourself quite well, and you know what's best for you. Do bureaucrats in the central government know what's best for you? Probably not.
Hay mucho más para aprender que para enseñar. Hay mucho más para leer que para escribir. Hay mucho más para sorprenderse que para estar seguro. Por supuesto, los seres humanos necesitamos un pequeño camalote de certezas para ir avanzando, porque si no, en incertidumbre extrema, no tendríamos de qué tabla agarrarnos, ¿no? A qué mástil nos atamos, cuáles son nuestras propias reglas interiores, cuáles son las propias reglas de convivencia, que son pocas y son imprescindibles. Pero la riqueza está justamente en la variedad, como la riqueza de un jardín que no es homogéneo, que no es de un solo color, que no es de un triste y opaco gris o marrón. En la variedad, en el diálogo, en el intercambio, en compartir con personalidades distintas, con proyectos de vida distintos, con gente que inventa cosas distintas, con distintas maneras de vivir la vida, con distintos sentimientos alrededor de las cosas, con distinta variedad de música, con distinta variedad de comida. Encontrar personas valiosas que nos transmiten más sentido a nuestra vida, eso necesita de la libertad. Y estar abierto a eso nos predispone en una actitud de humildad. Cuando uno entiende que nada más puede aprender es cuando dejó de aprender. Cuando uno en rigor cree que tiene la verdad y la sabiduría para organizar todo, dejó de comerciar. Y cuando uno hace eso, deja de respetar al otro. Deja de ver al otro como un igual, lo invisibiliza. O porque es distinto, o porque uno se enamora de la homogeneidad de su grupo. Y bueno, ese es un ejercicio que por supuesto Occidente hace y la civilización nuestra ha hecho más que otros y se permite. dudar de las facultades que tenemos los seres humanos sin perjuicio de saber que podemos lograr grandes cosas intercambiando y descubriendo juntos, socráticamente. Entonces la arrogancia conspira largamente contra la posibilidad de aprender, de descubrir, de compartir, de interactuar, de respetar al otro en su dignidad como un igual. Y ese es el secreto del liberalismo, no es tener más iPhones. El secreto del liberalismo, la buena nueva, es que el tipo que está lejos, lejos, lejos tuyo y que es diferente, tiene la misma dignidad que vos, tiene que ensayar su plan de vida con la misma libertad que vos, se tiene que hacer responsable igual que vos y tiene que haber un hilo de respeto, que es lo que hace la vida mucho más rica en todos los planos que nos imaginemos. Y la humildad es imprescindible para eso.
Muchas gracias, Walter. I have one final question for all three of you. We have about 6 minutes left, 5 minutes left. What is exactly the biggest threat to liberty today? Walter, cited the famous quote that fear is. Eamonn was discussing authoritarian regimes. Tom was talking about the far right, for example, in coalition with social democrats in New Zealand. Maybe you want to comment on each other's views or expand on your own as your final thoughts?
I know, I'll tell you. Complacency in the liberal societies, that we get so used to having the rule of law and having institutions that promote freedom, we don't even think about it. It's like the story of the little fish and the big fish, and the little fish says to the big fish, "Oh, how do you like the water?" And the big fish says, "What's water?" The big fish is just used to water. It doesn't even think about water, and we don't think about liberty. We don't think about the institutions of justice. We don't think about the rule of law and limits on politicians. They're just there, and I think that people certainly in the West, they kind of believe that the rest of the world must have those institutions too, because they can't imagine a world in which they haven't. So I think that is the greatest threat to liberty. It's just believing that, we can carry on, we can do whatever we like, we don't have to think about these things, and a few restrictions here, a few restrictions there, what difference is it going to make? But ultimately that undermines all of those cherished institutions.
A mí me parece que la amenaza más fuerte sobre la libertad en un sistema político son los falsos pregoneros de la libertad. Es decir, hay que tener mucho cuidado en las personas que se involucran en política levantando banderas liberales y que cuando se acercan al poder finalmente dan el ejemplo totalmente contrario de lo que declamaron. Creo que esos puñales por la espalda de gente que, promoviendo la libertad y obteniendo el voto de quienes quieren vivir en una sociedad más libre, llegan al poder y lo usan para sí, para hacer actos de corrupción, para meter a sus amigos, para plantear más regulaciones, para convivir con ellas, para soportar el status quo, merecen el escrutinio crítico del ciudadano atento, que no se puede desprender de su responsabilidad de defender la libertad solo votando por alguien que se dice liberal. Y eso es, como en el fondo, un ejemplo transmite más que 1000 palabras, y entonces una persona que declama las ideas y hace todo lo contrario, tira abajo todo el castillo. Digo, más allá de las buenas páginas que hay en los libros a propósito de la libertad, cuidemos a quienes dicen cuidar la libertad, porque es función de todo liberal no permitir que nadie se arrogue el monopolio de la libertad en su declamación. Sí, en la ejemplaridad, para rechazar la injusticia y los privilegios. Para mí, eso es la amenaza más importante, estar muy atento a las personas que se arriban al poder desde una perspectiva liberal, porque hacen mucho daño, te hacen retroceder muchos escalones cuando no cumplen con todas sus declamaciones. Entonces hay que estar alerta a eso también.
Well, I'll add to the wisdom that has gone before. The world's big, and there's lots of different situations where you have different threats in different places. One that I think is among the biggest is the growth in the idea of the true people versus the enemies of the people. This has been accentuated, I think, a little bit by social media. People put a lot of focus on that, but it's had some negative consequences. We get into our silos. You follow your friends on Twitter or on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or whatever. And we see other people as the enemy. And this enemy mentality inherently is illiberal. When you see your neighbors with whom you disagree as the enemy, you can't live with them. This has infected the United States in a very big way. Donald Trump pushed it strongly, but it was already there. The idea that we're the true people, the left or the right, whichever it is, and the others are the enemy. They're the unpeople. There was an Argentine writer about this, his book on populist reason. It's one of the worst books I've read in years because it's written in such bad language. But he said the whole point is to divide the population into the people and the enemies of the people. This is used by collectivists, by populists everywhere, and it is poison, absolute poison to liberty. Liberalism is about learning to live together with people who have different views, different lifestyles, different religions, and the enemy mentality is pure poison. And both the left and the right dip into this well of poison in order to attack liberal democracy. I think that's one of the big threats.
Well, thank you all very much for this incredible panel. Eamonn, Tom, Walter, muchísimas gracias, Eamonn, Tom, Walter, por este panel maravilloso que acabamos de tener. Muy interesante. Quiero ver cuáles son las ideas de nuestros co-conductores y moderadores. Nacho, Garrett. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Eamonn. Gracias, Walter. Nos estamos viendo.